following program is intended for mature audiences.
Welcome to Rudy's Revelation, finding revelation in the news and meaning in media. It's November 8, 2020. Today I'll be talking back to the Sunday Talking Heads on CBS Face the Nation, where Pennsylvania Republican Senator Pat Toomey says the state and the GOP is not finished yet. Also be checking in on Sunday morning propaganda at our favorite feel-good feature news program, CBS Sunday Morning, where correspondent Martha Teichner takes a look at a deeply divided country and urges the possibility of a post-Trump America. Also be turning into the Sunday New York Times, showing how the newspaper continually mischaracterizes the facts to mislead the public. Of course, I'll be going over the weekend headlines all in the next 30 minutes. First, I'll be taking you back to school and use some historical context to frame this week's news narratives. The word of the day is dialectical.
Relating to, or in accordance with dialectic, the Hegelian process of change in which a concept or its realization passes over into and is preserved and fulfilled by its opposite.
And the reason I get into the dialectic, obviously, is because of the Hegelian dialectic, or a characteristic of Hegel, his philosophy, or his dialectic method. Now, Hegelianism is the philosophy of Hegel, which can be summed up by the dictum that the rational alone is real, which means that all reality is capable of being expressed in rational categories. His goal was to reduce reality into a more synthetic unity within the system of absolute idealism. Hegel's method in philosophy consists of a tridectic development in each concept and each thing. Thus, he hopes philosophy will not contradict experience. And most people know the Hegelian dialectic as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And of course, George Hegel was a German philosopher whose most important figure in German idealism. He is considered one of the fundamental figures of the modern Western philosophy, with his influence extending to the entire range of contemporary philosophical issues, from aesthetics to ontology to politics, both in the analytical and continental tradition. Hegel's principal achievement was the development of the distinctive articulation of idealism, sometimes termed absolute idealism, in which the dualisms, for instance, mind and nature and the subject and object, are overcome. His philosophy of spirit conceptually integrates psychology, the state, history, art, religion, and his master-slave dialectic has been influential, especially in the 20th century France. Here from Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Hegel's dialectics in terms of the method of philosophical argument that involves some sort of contradictory process involving opposing sides. In what is perhaps the most classic version of dialectics, the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, for instance, presented his philosophical argument as a back and forth dialogue of debate, generally between the character of Socrates on one side and some person or group of people to whom Socrates was talking. In other words, you control the outcome if you control both sides of the argument. That was Hegel's dialectic. And then we're going to go into the book club.
Less than 3% of you people read books.
Hegel, A Very Short Introduction, and this is a book by Peter Singer. Hegel is regarded as one of the most influential figures of modern political and intellectual development. After painting Hegel's life and times in broad strokes, Peter Singer goes on to tackle some of the most challenging of Hegel's philosophy. And of course, there are Hegel's books themselves, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Elements of the Philosophy of Right, The Philosophy of History, Introduction to Philosophy of History with selections from the Philosophy of Right, Introductory lectures on Aesthetics, Science of Logic, Reason and History, Philosophy of Mind, all done by George Hegel. Get into the headlines. Giuliani says Trump won't concede amid legal challenges. Sources close to the president have told Fox he plans to graciously concede if the campaign's lawsuits fail. But we're going to bring up fraud here because people aren't really talking about fraud, but here, fixed computer glitch turns losing Republican into winner. This is from MSN, from the Detroit Free Press. Check your fact. Fact check. Does George Soros own the voting technology firm Smartmatic? Well, actually, he doesn't. But the CEO of Smartmatic actually sits on the board of the Open Society Foundation. From the Washington Times, Pittsburgh area ballot count delayed by mail glitch, court order. It's not just Philadelphia taking its time deciding who won Pennsylvania in the presidential race. About 35,000 ballots from Allegheny County, which includes Pittsburgh, won't start to be counted until Friday afternoon. And this was from the 6th. Fox 5 Atlanta. Software glitch causes delay counting thousands of votes in Gwinnett County. And this is in Georgia. A glitch in software has caused a delay in vote counting in Gwinnett County. From CBN News, a mess in Michigan. Glitch turns red county blue, plus 138,000 sudden votes for Biden. From Gizmodo, no, there isn't a glitch in Michigan election software that flipped thousands of Trump votes. They go on to describe, this is the straw man argument here, that the theory, which has no merit according to a statement from Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who is a Democrat, basically she claims that it was because a human error, that somebody didn't update the software. But they didn't dispute the fact that the glitch changed votes in the counting system. And they claim that this was the unofficial count and that it was fixed by a hand count after, but they didn't say whether there was a discrepancy or not. This is from the Federalist. Joe Biden says Democrats create the most extensive and inclusive voter fraud organization in American history. Many of you have probably seen this video. We're in a situation where we have put together, and you guys did it for our administration, President Obama's administration before this, we have put together, I think, the most extensive and inclusive voter fraud organization in the history of American politics. Now, the detractors of this statement say that, and here's the video, but the detractors of this statement say...
Secondly, we're in a situation where we have put together, and you guys did it for our the President Obama's administration before this. We have put together, I think, the most extensive and inclusive voter fraud organization in the history of American politics.
And people say that it was taken out of context, and maybe so, but most people consider that a Freudian slip. Election fraud in America, this is from September 25th, from Chuck DeVore from Forbes. Does election fraud happen on a coordinated, wide-scale basis or at the local level from time to time, or not at all? Contrary to the protestations of some in the media and the pundit class, election fraud does occur. The concerns are, how pervasive is it? Does it change election outcomes? And should we be concerned of the upcoming election? In Texas, Attorney General Ken Paxton announced that the arrest of 4 people, including the county commissioner, for illegal vote harvesting on September 24th. The elected official charged in the scheme won his primary election by 5 votes in 2018 after his opponent held a 19% lead on election night. The indictments total 123 felony charges for various corrupt election practices. The net result was someone won a race from a very important local office by cheating. So that's Forbes weighing in on fraud. And as much as the Democrats protest that fraud doesn't exist or that it could never change an election outcome, it just hasn't been proven on a wide scale. But as I mentioned before, it's in the delay, because you have to see how many votes your opposition comes up with if you want to beat it. Otherwise, it's just vote padding. And in those instances, you can't necessarily beat the tally if you don't know what it is. So you pad your votes, and you might pad the votes by tens of thousands of votes. But if your opponent is ahead by hundreds of thousands of votes, padding by tens of thousands of votes won't work. From the New York Post, forget traditional election maps. This is what the U.S. vote really looks like. And this is an article that goes into why some of the districts that were blue should have been Republican. From Newsweek, voter fraud is real. Here's how Democrats want to steal the 2020 election. This is an opinion piece by Newt Gingrich, and I'm just going to read a little bit of it. Make no mistake, voter fraud is real. Democrats, the media, and the so-called public interest groups on the political left will tell you otherwise, but they're either lying or totally ignorant. The voter fraud is a threat to the integrity of our elections, the heart of our democracy, and the Democrats want to make the problem worse with their new voting laws. Newt goes on to say, I believe this issue is incredibly important, more now than ever. So as part of my ongoing Election 2020 podcast series, I decided to examine voter fraud in depth in this week's episode of my podcast, Newt's World. And then he goes into, anyone who denies the existence of voter fraud in the U.S. needs to go to the Heritage Online database, which we have right here. There will find 1,285 proven instances of it, including 1,100 criminal convictions. Some of the stories are quite striking. In 2016, for example, Elbert Melton, the former mayor of Gordon, Alabama, illegally notarized 2 ballots without witnesses present while running for re-election. Melton won the race only by 16 votes. Many local and state races are decided by such small margins. He was convicted of absentee ballot fraud and removed from office and sentenced to 1 year in prison. The biggest way to expand voter fraud is by expanding voting by mail, and Democrats want to impose a universal vote by mail across the country. And then we're going to go right on to the Heritage site. I'll just read a couple from the top here. Randy Allen Jumper voted twice in the 2016 general election. This was in Arizona, California. Norman Hall of Los Angeles participated in a scheme to give homeless people on Skid Row cash and cigarettes in exchange for fraudulently signing ballot petition initiatives. In California from 2020, Bradley Jasperson of Pacifica forged signatures for a referendum initiative and was paid $5 for each signature. In California again, Richard Howard was involved in a scheme that offered cigarettes and money to homeless people. Louis Wise was involved in a scheme that offered cigarettes and money to homeless people. Christopher Williams was involved. Here's another one. California. From Louisiana, Dolores D. Handy of Crowley was found guilty of failing to mark a ballot as instructed when assisting an elderly voter, a misdemeanor. So people should check this out, the Heritage site. These are just individual cases of voter fraud, so it does happen. From the World Atlas, most rigged, fraudulent, and corrupt U.S. election in history. This is from June 2018. U.S. president election of 2004, 2002 New Hampshire Senate election, U.S. president election of 1960 in Illinois, 2006 Virginia U.S. Senate election, 2010 Maryland State Governor election, New York State Senate election in 1891, Kansas Territorial Legislative election of 1855, and it goes on and on their list of fraud. Joe Biden spent decades worrying of voter fraud, now called a myth by Dems. This is a story from the New York Post. The Democratic Party line treats voter fraud as little more than a GOP fever dream, yet the party's presidential candidate Joe Biden spent decades of his career sounding the alarm about it. Biden, the standard bearer, consistently shared GOP concerns of voter fraud during his 36 years as United States Senator from Delaware. Should voters be allowed to register on Election Day? No, Joe Biden wrote in an op-ed to a now Wilmington, Delaware newspaper in 1977. He even chided President Carter for proposing it. Moving right along. This is from the Federalist again. Reports of election fraud keep piling up in Michigan. What's going on? It appears that Democrats in Detroit, a city with a long history of election fraud, are tampering with absentee ballots and breaking state law. And this is an article by John Daniel Davidson. As absentee ballot counting continues in a handful of key states across the country, reports of voter fraud, ballot tampering, and illegal removal of Republican election observers are cropping up in Michigan, especially in Detroit, a Democratic stronghold, which has a long history of voter fraud. USA Today fact check: Georgia ballot curing is not election fraud. This is from November 6th. And if you don't know what curing is setting aside a ballot and then allowing, if it is filled out improperly, allowing the voter to correct any mistakes that might be on that ballot. This is from the Washington Times. Texas AG to investigate shocking election fraud scheme and Project Veritas sting. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton on Tuesday said that his election fraud unit is investigating what he called a shocking election fraud scheme shown in a hidden camera investigation released by Project Veritas. In the 18-minute expose showed a female ballot chaser in San Antonio describing an elaborate multi-person operation involving thousands of voters in which she convinces them to vote for her candidates, helping them change their ballots, pick ups, and drop off ballots, and even give voters gifts. From Real Clear Politics, 28 million mail-in ballots went missing in last 4 elections. Between 2012 and 2018, 28 million mail-in ballots remain unaccounted for, according to data from the Federal Election Assistance Commission. The missing ballots amount to nearly 1 in 5 of all absentee ballots and ballots mailed to voters residing in states that do elections exclusively by mail. From the Washington Examiner, Democratic operative says he's been committing voter fraud for decades and warns of coming war November 3rd over this stuff. An anonymous Democratic operative revealed that he's been rigging mail-in ballots for decades. And his quote is, "This is the real thing, and there's going to be a fucking war coming November 3rd over this stuff." The operative who spoke to the New York Post on the condition of anonymity explained if they knew how the sausage was made, they could fix it. The whistleblower described himself as a Bernie Sanders supporter and said that he chose to come forward a couple months before the election in hopes that the election officials will beef up security. So we're going to tear into the New York Times, and of course on the front page that Biden beats Trump, and newspapers don't call elections, and so since the election is being contested, they really shouldn't be doing that, but they went ahead anyway. Voters say Black Lives Matter protests were important. They disagree on why. About a fifth of the voters said that the protests were the single most important factor in their decision on the ballot box, according to a new survey. And this is an article by Sabrina Tavernise and John Elegant. And the lead goes, the protests that break out after the police killing of George Floyd in May were some of the biggest racial justice marches organized in decades. In the early weeks, polling showed broad and deep support for them across the country. That's incorrect. There weren't broad support. So the reason I picked up this article, I wanted to go into it, is because if you read down into the articles, this is not the America I want to live in anymore, and reinforce the resolve to Trump, because it goes into Trump supporters. Anne Marie Kelly, a white medical worker who lives a couple of hours away in Strasburg, Pennsylvania, said she was horrified by the vandalism and the looting that followed the protests in some cities that made her feel that this is not the America I want to live in, and reinforce the resolve to vote for Trump. So it goes on and how, it had broad-based support except for white Trump voters. Most people didn't want to see those kind of protests. Nobody has a problem with protests. Nobody had a problem with the Occupy protests, if anybody remembers those, because they were peaceful. But when you start burning and looting and demanding things, it's a whole different story. Quotation of the day: despite warnings, the election actually ran smoothly. Another article from the New York Times: after warnings it could go off the rails, the election actually ran smoothly amid the logistical challenges of voting in a pandemic. Despite threats of foreign interference, violence, and disinformation, the machinery of the democracy held up quite well. It's an article by Reed Epstein. In Georgia, a high school senior organized her classmates to be poll workers so voters would not have to wait hours in line like they did back in June. So, the result of the relatively smooth election was free of the hours-long lines and vote-suppressing shenanigans that have characterized the voter experience in recent years. As Hong Kong law goes after black sheep, fear clouds universities. Campuses have long been hubs of protests in the city. Now the authorities have promised to root out teachers who bring politics into the classrooms. It's okay here, just not in Hong Kong. This is a story by Vivian Wang. When Harry Yu, a professor at the medical humanities at the University of Hong Kong, gave a lesson last fall about doctors' responsibilities in society, he focused on a real-world example: the volunteer medics treating protesters and police in the anti-government demonstrations convulsing the city. Well, that's gone now because of COVID, and now that the CCP has completely taken off China. But this semester, after China imposed a new national security law in Hong Kong, Professor Wu hastily reworked his lesson plan. He included photographs of the protests in his lecture slides, but did not explicitly address them. Before uploading the slides to the university portal after class, he deleted the photographs altogether. It's right in front of your eyes, but you don't have any opportunity to talk about this in class. As China tries to quell the political upheaval in Hong Kong, the city's universities, ranked among the best in Asia, if not the world, have become potent symbols of a shrinking space for dissent or even discussion. Sounds like a worldwide issue we're having. So we always go into the Sunday Review before we get into Talking Heads. Of course, lots of Trump bashing, but this is what I wanted to get into. A couple of these. Trump's tweeting is strategic, not crazy. And this other one by Ross Dudat. Is there Trumpism after Trump? Is there Trumpism after Trump? His presidency showed a path to a conservatism that's multi-ethnic, middle-class, and populist, but soon he may stand in its way. And Ross goes off. Way back in the days of the 2012 election, the last Republican presidential defeat, all the conventional wisdom in American politics converged on a simple idea: the GOP was doomed as a national institution unless it became, in effect, a moderate party of the business class, stiff-arming social conservatives and wooing Hispanic voters by promising more liberal immigration laws. Against this consensus, a few observers made dissenting points. First, a lot of working-class white voters who tilted Republican and stayed home amid Mitt Romney's business class campaign in 2012. And second, the Hispanic vote was hardly a single-issue voting, pro-immigration monolith. So it was an easy to imagine Republicans surviving in a changing country by simply becoming more populist on economic issues, as it was to imagine them moving into a more libertarian direction favored by the party's donors and consultants. So he goes on to say that the Trump movement was a success and that Republicanism is now the party for the working class, and will it survive after Trump? And it was actually here before Trump. It was called the Tea Party, and it'll be here after Trump. So in this opinion piece by Emily Dreyfus, Trump's tweeting isn't crazy, it's strategic, typos and all. A network of right-wing operatives and activists and the president himself spread disinformation about Joe Biden with one simple hashtag. On Wednesday afternoon, the presidential race unresolved, a protester in Nevada interrupted the election officials' news conference by yelling, "The Biden crime family is stealing the election." That moment wasn't random. Hashtag Biden crime family is part of a year-long effective disinformation campaign against Joe Biden, one that was spread by social media, political influencers, and the president himself. So she goes on to say that there was a tweet where the president misspelled family, and then people ran with that, and minutes later, he tweeted the hashtag Biden crime family with a typo in the word family. That was it. No context, no link. And so she frames this all up as some conspiracy theory. Like, there is no, that there's no evidence for the Bidens benefiting financially from Joe Biden's access in politics, from the Chinese, from the Ukrainians, from a lot of different people. So this is just wrong. This is a more, speaking of disinformation, this is more disinformation. Now, the internet world is very crazy, and with all these hashtags and stuff, and people get involved in the QAnon, and everything's a big mystery, and it's all very interesting. But the reality is that Biden is corrupt, and that everybody who voted for Joe Biden and the Biden-Harris ticket is voting for the establishment, which is corrupt, and that they're backing that corruption by the vote. It doesn't matter how much you don't like Donald Trump, that you're voting for an establishment that is corrupt, and one of the reasons it's corrupt is they benefit, and their families benefit financially from political dealings in pay-for-play schemes. Happened with the Clinton Foundation, and it happens with the Bidens. This is not news, and this is a straw man argument to say that the president tweeted something and then someone picked it up, and the hashtag took a complicated issue with legitimate questions about Hunter Biden's business dealings with Ukraine and China and reduced it to a slogan that could be used to spread falsehoods about Joe Biden. You see what I'm saying here? The hashtag took a complicated issue with legitimate questions about Hunter Biden's business dealings with Ukraine and China and reduced it to a slogan. Well, that just sounds like good marketing to me. All right, let's move off to the talking heads here, and we're going to listen in on Maggie Brennan with Republican Senator from Pennsylvania, Pat Toomey.
Your home state, as we just said, put Biden over the top. Is it time for President Trump to concede?
70 million Americans voted for Donald Trump, and they and the president deserve to have this process play out. Now, I understand yesterday the media projected how this is going to end. There's a reason that we actually do the count. And by the way, part of our process is to adjudicate disputes. It can include recounts. In fact, under Pennsylvania law, there's an automatic recount if the vote margin is 0.5% at the moment. Joe Biden is leading in Pennsylvania by only 0.6%. So let's let this come to its proper conclusion, and in the process, maximize the number of people who have confidence it was done properly.
Well, Joe Biden is ahead by more than 30,000 votes.
Pennsylvania law has an automatic recount. We should follow the law. Now, if it comes to a lead that's outside of the automatic recount margin, then Pennsylvania law gives the losing candidate the opportunity to petition for a recount. The loser has to pay for it. But there's nothing wrong with following the process of the law. We're not finished yet. That's all. That's all I'm saying.
All right. We have to take a commercial break. Just a moment ago, you were saying, rightfully, that it is well within the president's team's legal right to raise questions or to ask for recounts. But there's a whole lot of noise being made by a lot of presidential allies who are alleging far more than that, using terms like fraud, rigged. In fact, Lindsey Graham, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, saying he's asking the Justice Department to investigate claims here. There are 9 GOP congressmen from your state who are questioning the integrity of election officials. Isn't this damaging overall to our democracy?
Every election has some irregularities. We've had some in Pennsylvania in the past. We had some in Pennsylvania this time. They should be adjudicated. If people have seen, if there is evidence of fraud or wrongdoing, by all means, go into a federal court, get it corrected, punish the wrongdoers, correct the vote count, and do what we need to do. That's what I think should happen. Apparently, there are going to be a lot of lawsuits tomorrow. We'll see the evidence. We'll see what the allegations are. I have confidence in our federal judiciary to make the right decisions about them. Well, to be clear, for instance, there are some problems that need to be solved. For instance, in Pennsylvania, unfortunately, we have a rogue state Supreme Court that violated the U.S. Constitution and violated Pennsylvania law by declaring that ballots arriving after the election day can be counted, even though our statute forbids that. So that needs to be adjudicated. Those ballots should not be counted. Now, I don't think those are enough.
Those ballots have been segregated. And CBS News has learned about 8,500 of them.
Okay. But observers in Philadelphia, anyway, have not been able to get close enough to understand how that segregation has occurred. This is the kind of thing, but it's understandable that people would want that corrected. And we should, for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is future elections.
The Republican Party has remade itself as the party of Trump. Do you believe that is still the mandate?
Well, I will tell you, unambiguously, this was a rejection of the radicalism that has increasingly been the driving force in the Democratic Party. The woke left had a major setback. I mean, nobody thought we were going to pick up seats in the House. Nobody thought we were going to hold the Senate. We didn't lose a single legislative body across the country.
But the president also didn't take
in
your
our state
state.
House and Senate. This administration has been remarkably successful with economic outcomes, with foreign policy. So I think the policies have been accepted, and the broad Republican victories down ballot suggest that.
All right. Senator Toomey, thank you for your insights.
All right, now we're going to go move over to our Sunday morning propaganda, where Martha Teichner takes a look at the deeply divided country that we're living in now politically. And one of her guests is Fareed Zakaria. So let's listen in.
This is a major fraud in our nation.
President Trump has not called to congratulate Biden. He has not conceded defeat. He continues to cry foul.
But ultimately, I have a feeling judges are going to have to rule.
CBS News has learned the president vows to keep fighting the results in court and will not concede.
Is whether a litigious president, unwilling to go down without a fight, will get his ultimate wish.
So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court.
What we do know is what we saw for ourselves.
This will be the most important election in the history of our country.
Ballots cast in numbers demonstrating how intensely Republicans and Democrats both believe that the course of our democracy was indeed on the line.
Huge turmoil, an impeachment before that. You have ended up seeing the partisan divide as deep, as rooted, as ever.
Journalist Fareed Zakaria is the author of 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World.
In some ways, the pandemic has been a great revealer. In others, it's been an accelerator. We're really two countries.
So, no real movement across the ideological divide. Think World War I trench warfare, advances and retreats measured in feet. Stalemate, but a war just the same.
When have you ever seen plywood? Just think about that for a second. After an election day.
Describe an emotion you've felt this past
Wake up!
Anxiety?
Wake up!
Fear of what might happen?
50 years ago when I moved to the US from Lebanon, and I never thought I would be concerned about violence, conflict, and even bloodshed. What I've seen around the world is far, far more violent, bloody, and destructive conflict and civil war. We're not there. We're not there. But nonetheless, that is not to say we should not be concerned. I think Americans should be worried about the fabric of our society really fracturing. We haven't crossed that line. It hasn't fractured yet, but we're not too far from that line either.
This is the United States. That can't happen here.
We did it, Joe. You're going to be the next president of the United States.
Voter fraud!
Not celebrating the roughly 70 million Americans who voted for President Trump.
We won't stop!
How many of them no longer trust the legitimacy of the process? Such as this man in Georgia.
Wake up! Wake up!
Words.
It almost seemed like they were waiting to see how many votes Trump had, and then they would count the rest to make sure Biden had just enough.
How likely is it that Joe Biden will convince nearly half the electorate that he is their president too?
Philadelphia elections are crooked as a snake.
They are setting the stage to potentially steal an election.
The dozens and dozens of executive orders and regulatory rollbacks President Trump signed into effect. With the stroke of his pen, Joe Biden plans to start undoing them on day one, January 20th.
Joe Biden can demonstrate that there are two Americas and one does want to be engaged. He can move aggressively and intelligently, but it won't change the fact that people have seen that other America. And they know it's lying there, maybe dormant for now, but it could rear its head again.
A lot can happen between now and Inauguration Day.
All right, that's it for us. See you next Sunday. Rudy's Revelation.
I got a bad feeling. I don't think I'm gonna make it out of here.